9,000 years ago, on a frozen island in the middle of the largest lake in North America, someone built a fire against a wall of solid rock. They waited. Hours later, they threw cold water on the glowing stone, and it cracked open. Inside was something that shouldn't have existed yet. Pure metal. Not ore. Not rock that needed melting in a furnace. Actual, usable copper, sitting there ready to be pulled straight out of the earth. This happened 4,000 years before Egypt built its first pyramid. And it happened on an island most Americans have never even heard of. That island is Isle Royale. Today, it's one of the least visited national parks in the entire country. Wolves, moose, and hiking trails, sitting alone in the cold waters of Lake Superior. But underneath those quiet ridgelines is a secret that took geologists more than a century to fully understand. Thousands of pits, some no bigger than a bathtub, some cut 20 feet down into raw stone. Not natural, not accidental. Dug, one strike at a time, by human hands, thousands of years before metalworking was supposed to exist anywhere in the Americas. So how did this happen? And why here? The answer starts more than 1 billion years ago, when this part of North America nearly tore itself apart. Geologists call it the Midcontinent Rift, a massive crack that opened in the Earth's crust and filled, again and again, with lava. As those lava flows cooled, something unusual happened. Mineral-rich fluid moved through the rock and left behind copper, not locked up in or that needs to be roasted and chemically processed, but copper in its pure metallic form. Geologists call it native copper. And on Earth, that is extraordinarily rare. Everywhere else in the world, getting copper out of the ground means smelting, extreme heat, controlled fire, real chemistry knowledge. But not here. On Isle Royale and the neighboring Keweenaw Peninsula, copper came out of the ground already finished. Sheets of it, veins of it running through the rock. Glaciers had even dragged some of it to the surface, leaving nuggets and masses just lying there, some weighing hundreds, even thousands of pounds. This one geological accident is the reason a Stone Age people, with no bronze, no iron, no smelting technology at all, became some of the earliest metalworkers on the planet. Nobody in the modern world knew any of this until the 1840s. American surveyors arrived on the Upper Peninsula chasing a copper rush, expecting virgin ground. Instead, they kept finding trenches, pits, grooves cut for hundreds of feet, following copper veins with an accuracy that stunned them. Someone had already been here. Someone had already found the richest deposits, the exact same ones 19th century engineers were now blasting open with dynamite and steam power. At a site that came to be called the Minong Mine, geologists counted dozens of ancient pits sunk straight into copper-bearing rock, some over 20 feet deep. At the bottom, stone hammers, wooden tools, charred wood. Centuries of moss and soil had grown over the top, hiding them so well that more than one 19th century miner broke straight through an ancient shaft without realizing what he'd just destroyed. By the early 1900s, surveyors had cataloged more than 10,000 of these pits across the region. On Isle Royale alone, they cluster along ridgelines, Minong Ridge, McCargo Cove, the shores of Lake Deesir, an entire ancient industrial landscape, hiding in plain sight under second-growth forest. The obvious question was, how old is this? Early guesses were based on nothing more than tree rings and soil depth, 1,000 years, maybe 2. But radiocarbon dating changed everything. As scientists tested charcoal and wood pulled from the bottom of these pits, the numbers kept climbing. 7,000 years, 8,000. Some dates pushed past 9,000 years before present. That places this mining inside what archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex, a tradition of Great Lakes peoples extracting and shaping native copper as far back as 6,000 BCE, long before the Bronze Age reached most of the ancient world. Long before smelting was even conceived of in the Near East, a Stone Age culture, on a remote island in Lake Superior, was already working metal. But here's the part that makes it even more impressive. They had no furnaces, no molds, no liquid metal poured into shape. Everything they did with fire, water, stone, and raw human effort. Picture it. A crew of miners finds a promising vein running through the bedrock. They can't blast it, can't drill it, can't melt it out. So they build a fire directly against the rock and let it burn for hours until the stone itself is scorching hot. Then, cold water, carried up from the lake in skins or bark containers, thrown straight onto the glowing surface. The shock cracks the rock apart from the inside. That's thermal shock, and it was the opening move in almost every dig on this island. Once the rock was weakened, out came the hammerstones, dense, fist-sized rocks, chosen specifically because they wouldn't shatter on impact. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of them out of these pits, every one battered and worn from repeated pounding. Some pits are littered with hundreds of broken hammerstones, discarded the moment they cracked, replaced, and used again. This wasn't quick work. This was days, weeks, sometimes months of relentless, repetitive labor for a single vein of copper. Wooden wedges and levers came next, prying loose the fragments that fire and stone had already broken free. Most of that would rotted away centuries ago, but in a few deep, waterlogged pits, oxygen-poor conditions preserved it. Chart stakes, possible fragments of ladders or scaffolding, a tantalizing glimpse of infrastructure that otherwise vanished completely. And then there was the copper itself, because some of it simply would not move. Nuggets weighing over 5,000 pounds have been documented in this region. You cannot carry that. You cannot even budget. So the miners didn't try. Instead, they attacked the mass exactly where it lay. More fire, more hammering, chipping off workable pieces bit by bit, sometimes over an entire season. Several of these giant masses are still sitting on Isle Royale today, frozen mid-extraction, covered in ancient hammer marks, abandoned when winter came, or when the effort simply wasn't worth it anymore. Getting the copper out of the ground was only half the job. Turning it into something useful was its own kind of mastery. Native copper is soft enough to shape without melting, but hammer it too much, too fast, and it turns brittle and cracks apart in your hands. Somehow, without any written science, without any formal metallurgy, these ancient smiths figured out the fix. Heat it. Let it rest. Hammer it again. Heat it again. That cycle, cold hammering combined with periodic heating, what modern metallurgists call annealing, relieves stress inside the metal and keeps it workable. Archaeologists can see the evidence of this technique preserved directly in the artifacts, alternating patterns of hammering and heat treatment, refined over generations. The results speak for themselves. Spear points, knives, fishhooks, awls, chisels, axes, beads, bracelets, and pendants. And this copper didn't stay on the island. Chemical analysis has traced Lake Superior copper all the way to sites hundreds of miles away, part of trade networks that stretched across a huge portion of what is now the eastern United States. An island most people have never heard of was, for thousands of years, quietly supplying metal to an entire continent. So who were these people? For a long time, the honest answer got buried under a very dishonest one. 19th and early 20th century writers looked at this level of engineering and simply refused to credit it to the ancestors of the native nations still living in the region. Instead, they invented stories, a vanished, lost race, wandering Phoenicians, some mysterious older civilization that had somehow disappeared without a trace. It wasn't evidence driving that theory. It was the bias of the era, unwilling to imagine that indigenous peoples could have built something this sophisticated. The archaeology tells a very different story, one of continuity, not disappearance. The Old Copper Complex represents a widespread tradition among archaic period peoples of the Western Great Lakes, likely small, mobile groups who traveled to Isle Royale seasonally, worked the copper, and moved on before the brutal Lake Superior winter set in. And the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe people, whose presence and oral tradition around this lake reach back long before any European set foot here, have carried the cultural memory of this copper for generations. In Ojibwe tradition, copper was never just a resource to be extracted. It carried spiritual weight, tied to ancestral memory and the land itself. Modern archaeology is only now catching up to what oral tradition preserved all along. Isle Royale became a national park in 1940, and that isolation, no roads, no easy access, barely any visitors compared to mainland parks, has worked in favor of history. Most of these ancient pits remain untouched, protected less by policy than by sheer remoteness. Researchers now use tools like LiDAR to map pit clusters hidden under dense forest canopy without disturbing a single stone, while advances in radiocarbon dating keep sharpening exactly how old, how extensive, and how far-reaching this ancient industry really was. What's left? when you put it all together, is one of the earliest and longest-running metal industries on the planet, built entirely without smelting, without writing, without a single tool made of anything but stone, wood, fire, and water. For thousands of years, people worked this island, freeing tons of pure copper out of solid rock using nothing but ingenuity and sheer persistence. It's a story that quietly rewrites what we think we know about the pace of human progress, and it's still sitting there, under the moss, on an island almost nobody visits.